scale to the power of 5. So now you start to understand why at small length scales you can use the Kelvin body force. Remember, I started out by saying that natural convection scales is 1 over 2 length cubed. The Kelvin body force actually scales as 1 over length to the power of 5. So you can see that as you shrink the length scales, this becomes a more and more effective technique. So what are we saying over here? What we're saying over here is that if you have arteries where the Reynolds number, so for those of you who've taken a cardiovascular blood flow class, it's basically cardiovascular fluid mechanics class, you know that the Reynolds numbers in the arteries are fairly large. They're, and the flow can be turbulent. So the moral of the story over here is that if you have treatments that are in the arteries which have very high Reynolds numbers, this is not an effective technique. But if you're thinking about treatments in the peripheral vasculature like the capillaries, where the Reynolds number is of the order of 1 to 10, then this could be a viable technique. So you can model these things, just sort of throwing that out there, which essentially confirms why the physical phenomena occurs. You can look at the effect of dipole strength, what happens when you increase the magnetic field, what happens when you decrease the magnetic field. But for you all, the takeaway line is, if you have big arteries, and if you have, let's say, a stenosis in a big artery, then this is not a viable technique. Ask your physician to perform bypass surgery or an angioplasty and non-magnetic drug targeting. But if this is essentially something that happens in the peripheral vasculature, like the capillaries, etc., very, very viable technique, because you don't want those capillaries to be punctured by the catheter that the physician has. So the behavior in pulsatile flow is a little different. Pulsatile flows have some different dynamics. You have to now no longer only consider the Reynolds number, you also have to consider the Womersley number. So those of you who've taken a cardiovascular fluid mechanics class, in my department we have that at the senior level, and for first year graduate students, so I'm not sure where you have that over here. But you know that it's not only the Reynolds number, but it's also the Womersley number. The Womersley number is a counterpart to the Struan number. It's basically a time-dependent or frequency-dependent number. And so there are some competing effects that happen. What are these competing effects? These competing effects are that flow oscillations produce additional perturbations. Because flow oscillations produce additional perturbations, the dissipation in the dynamically assembled structure are larger, so that structure dissipates even more rapidly. And so essentially what we are trying to show over here is that if you have steady flow, you can maintain the structure for a long time. But if you have pulsatile flow, the structure dissipates very, very rapidly. Again, the takeaway is the Womersley number and the effect of oscillations is going to be more dominant in the larger blood vessels as opposed to the smaller blood vessels. So once again, the takeaway is smaller blood vessels, viable technique. Larger blood vessels, it's not going to be a viable technique. So again, you know, the effect of flow Reynolds number shows no surprises. The higher the Reynolds number, the greater your washover is going to be. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, a neurosurgeon, or in fact a cardiovascular surgeon to tell you that, because the shear effects, the inertial effects are also really large. Let me jump to another application in the interest of time. This is magnetic fluid hyperthermia. Magnetic fluid hyperthermia is a heating application. So essentially what happens is that you can load a tissue with magnetic nanoparticles. Up to now I've only talked about a DC magnetic field. I've talked about steady magnetic fields. Now we're going to talk about AC magnetic fields. In AC magnetic fields, you take the orientation of the magnetic field according to a particular frequency. And so what happens in the presence of an AC magnetic field is that the magnetic particles rotate. There are two kinds of rotations of magnetic nanoparticles. They're called Neal relaxations and Brownian relaxations. If a magnetic nanoparticle is small, if it's smaller than, say, about 4 or 5 nanometers, the monopole inside the magnetic nanoparticle will move freely without the nanoparticle moving itself. I know it's a counterintuitive concept, but suffice it to say, if you if you look up the literature on Neal relaxations for very, very small particles, if you change the orientation of a magnetic field, the magnetic structure inside the nanoparticle moves, but the nanoparticle is in fact stationary. When nanoparticles become larger, that is, that they're larger than about 4 nanometers, then as you move the magnetic field, as you rotate the magnetic field, which is basically what you do with an AC magnetic field, the particle will also rotate. When the particle rotates, you get what is called magneto-viscous dissipation. That magneto-viscous dissipation is essentially a friction effect. Particle is laden, there's a tumor which is laden with nanoparticles. You have an AC magnetic field. The particles are rotating. When the particles rotate, they create friction. That friction heats up the local tissue. If you heat up the local tissue above 42 degrees centigrade for more than 20 minutes, you will destroy that tissue. Now with Neal relaxation with very, very small magnetic particles, it's also possible to do that. But the relaxation time is so rapid that it's not as effective. You would have to take hours as opposed to minutes to accomplish the heating with Neal relaxation as you would do with Brownian relaxation. Anyway, the concept here is that you essentially isolate the tumor. You inject the tumor with magnetic nanoparticles. You either do it systemically and concentrate them into magnetic targeting, or you actually take a syringe and you inject the tumor with the magnetic nanoparticles. You put a patient under an MRI, but you have an AC magnetic field. Because of the Brownian relaxations, the local tissue heats up, and when it heats up, it dies if you heat it to 42 degrees Celsius above 20 minutes. But the world is not that simple. It's a heat transfer problem. If you heat up the cancerous tissue, there's going to be thermal conduction. There's also blood perfusion in the body. The blood perfusion will basically convect the heat away. So you will have heat convection and heat conduction from the cancerous tissue to the surrounding healthy tissue. The challenge here is only to heat up the cancerous tissue and not heat up the surrounding healthy tissue. So there are many ways to analyze this. You start out with essentially an energy conservation equation. For those of you in biomedicine, this is the so-called Pennis bioheat transfer equation. It's nothing but a modified energy equation. It's fairly simplistic. So you take that equation and you put in magneto dissipation, the power dissipation into it. And when you scale these equations, you find that the dominant effects occur through some numbers that you are familiar with. The first number is the Peclet number, which is the ratio of convection to conduction. So you want low convection from the tumor because you don't want the heat to dissipate to the healthy tissue and also raise the temperature of the healthy tissue. The second operative number is the Joule number, which is the ratio of the heating energy to the magnetic energy. You want to be as efficient as possible. And if you're putting in magnetic energy, you want it to go into heating. It's compounded, this problem is compounded by the fact that the FDA has set strict guidelines as to how much electromagnetic radiation a patient can have. Because after a certain amount, electromagnetic radiation or magnetic fields above a certain level are deemed to be unsafe. So you want the magnetic energy to be minimal, but the heating energy to be maximal. That is, you want the conversion efficiency to be very high. The last number is the Fourier number, which compares the thermal time, the heat up time, to the magnetic fluctuation time, which is the frequency of the AC field that you have. So when you do an analysis, it's pretty straightforward. Now you have 3 parameters, you vary these 3 parameters. Your problem is that there is a cancerous tumor. That's so for sake of simplicity, we assume that it's a spherical tumor that's surrounded by healthy tissue. We assume blood perfusion through it. And so essentially what you want is that the interface between these, the cancerous tumor and the healthy tissue, should always be below 42 degrees Celsius. You can set a target 40 degrees Celsius, 39, 38, whatever. And then what you find is that you then have a competition between the Joule number and the Peclet number. That is that